And welcome to Bible study, particularly if you're watching online today. We're carrying on our study of the life of Joseph, and we find ourselves today in Genesis 42. So for those of you that are here, if you've got the church Bibles, it's on page 47. And I'm going to read the whole of this chapter. It's quite long, so pin your ears back. Genesis 42. Which is on page 47. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them. "You have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, and then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on the donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "This man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, We are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan." Then the man who is Lord over the land said to us, "This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land." As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Then Reuben said to his father, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you, and trust him to my care, and I will bring him back." But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow." Well, it's quite the story, isn't it? I don't know how many of you watch box sets or series? What's the plural of series? It is a plural, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, one of those on TV, and when one episode ends, they always leave you on a bit of a they call it a cliffhanger, don't they? And so the way that kind of TV services like Netflix and the like work is that when you watch the end of a series, up in the top it says something like "next episode starts in 15 seconds," and you can press the button to start straight away and whatever. And if you're like me, you're always tempted to watch the first kind of minute or so, because you then realise what happens next. And as you're reading and going through this study of the life of Joseph, I believe you started in Genesis 37, as each chapter ends, you're kind of left on a bit of a cliffhanger. It's like, what will happen next? And that's the case here in Genesis 42. As at the end of this, it's, well, what are the brothers going to do next? And Joseph has met with them, they've been reunited, and they're left in this kind of dilemma. And we're going to look at some of the verses in here. We can't cover the whole of a chapter this size in one session, but we're going to look at some of these verses to just try and get a sense as to what's going on here. And we swing from chapter 41 to 42. The drama is just kind of unfolding, and we hit this key point in the whole narrative of the story of Joseph, where he is reunited with his brothers. It's thought that if you look at the chronology of this, it's around 20 years have passed since the time when Joseph's brothers sold him for money, leaving him in his father's understanding as dead, sold him to Midianite traders, who then, as you will know if you've been part of this Bible study for the last few weeks, those traders then sold him on to Egypt. Chapter 42 is set in the context of the first year of the famine. So you would have covered Pharaoh's dream. That would have been last week, actually. Pharaoh's dream, when he gets this dream of fat and thin cows, and the interpretation that Joseph gives that there's going to be 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. And we're hitting the time here where they've had the 7 years of feast, and they've stored up the grain to cover Egypt for the period of famine that's ahead. Verse 1, Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, and he said to his sons, "Why do you keep just looking at each other?" It's a typical dad comment, this is. Something's happened, and they look at all the children, and it's like, well, you just keep looking at each other. Do something. That's what he's saying here. It's like, do something about it. It's no good just looking blankly at each other. And there's grain in Egypt. That's the message that he's given. He says, I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go there and buy some. Now, the reality is, the brothers were most likely not looking at each other in just, well, what are we going to do? And in laziness or idleness or anything like that. They knew that it was very likely that their brother, 20 years ago, when they sold him to the traders, they knew it was very likely that he would have ended up in Egypt. And the very mention from their dad of Egypt would have brought fear to them. They probably had kept this terrible secret for 20 years and rarely talked about it. If you've got something in your past that you're ashamed of, you rarely talk about it, even with those closest to you. And I suspect this is why the brothers are just looking at each other, and Jacob questions their strange behavior. Why do you just keep looking at each other? So Jacob, if we kind of go on in the story, sends his sons to Egypt, with the exception of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin at this point, and to be honest, this is part of what caused the issues in the first place, because Jacob had a favourite son, that was Joseph. Benjamin has kind of taken on that role, and that would have been because Benjamin was the other son of Jacob's favourite wife. He had a few. His favourite wife, Rachel, who by this point in the story had died. So Jacob keeps Benjamin and sends the other 10 to Egypt. And they arrive in Egypt, and we read this in verse 6. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Now, I'm just going to read some verses from the first chapter that you would have looked at about probably 6 weeks ago. From Genesis 37. You needn't turn to it. But we read this. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. 20 years later, here they are, in front of Joseph, as it were, 10 sheaves bowing down to the one that had stood upright. And it's at that point we read that Joseph recognized them. So he recognizes them immediately, but they don't know it's him. I wonder if you were Joseph, what you would have done. I think I would have wanted to sort this out straight away. But that wasn't Joseph's way. What makes Joseph different from the natural reaction that I would have had, and I suspect some of you may have had? Well, last week, Gareth mentioned various things, but one of the verses he focused on was verse 38 of chapter 41. Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, talking of Joseph, one in whom is the Spirit of God? This is what makes Joseph stand out amongst many of the other characters in this book of Genesis. Gareth's notes from last week, and one of the notes said, "The Spirit of the Lord inspires good planning and decision making." And we see this here with Joseph. The impulsive thing to do would have been, as they're bowed down before him, for him to say something like, and this would be possibly my natural inclination, "Well, I told you so." Remember that dream? And at that point, they would have all probably remembered. The fear would have got even worse because they'd have realized who it was they were speaking to. But Joseph doesn't do that. And we'll see in this chapter, as we kind of continue, other instances of when Joseph acts in a way that I believe is inspired by the Spirit of God and not by his natural or human inclinations. So what ensues is a conversation within which Joseph repeatedly accuses them of being spies. We read later on in the chapter that Joseph uses an interpreter, which is interesting, because he would have known their language, but he uses an interpreter, the reason being to avoid the risk of being recognized were he to speak Hebrew with them. They reply to his questioning in this way. They say, verse 13, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Again, I'd be wanting to say, "Well, actually, you're not right there." And identifying myself. But that's not the case with Joseph. I'd have loved to seen the look on Joseph's face as at this point the lie is told. They've been living with deceit for 20 years, and now it just continues. What they don't also realize, as we read here in the text, is that Joseph could understand everything they said because they understood Hebrew. So what does Joseph do? Well, he puts them in prison for 3 days. It seems an odd thing to do, to put them in prison for 3 days. They would have felt quite aggrieved at that. They hadn't really done anything wrong at this point. They turned up, and Joseph accuses them of being spies, which is not the case. Joseph knows that's not the case, and they get put in prison for 3 days. And I was wondering in my preparation for today what that is all about. And we can skip over sometimes in the Bible some kind of what seems to be a minor bit of information. But I think there's probably some things that we can learn from what Joseph does. He put them in custody, all of them, for 3 days. I think, and I haven't consulted the commentaries to see whether I'm right or wrong here, but I think Joseph wanted some time to reflect. What should I do next? Actually, if you look through Scripture, you can find many instances of when in Scripture men of God take a step to one side when something very significant has happened before they decide what to do next. Men and women of God. Sorry, I didn't say that. Jesus, a good example, when he goes to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, do you remember? There's all this adulation, and it says in only one of the Gospels, actually, I think it's Mark, that mentions this. You know, we read that story and we think Jesus goes in on the donkey, down the Mount of Olives, into Jerusalem, goes into the temple, sees the terrible scene there where the house of God is being kind of used for all kinds of things that it's not supposed to be used for. And then we know that he kind of turns the tables upside down, destroys the tables of the money changers, those selling doves and pigeons and all the animals for sacrifice. Mark happens to mention that Jesus saw the temple and then returned to Bethany. And then the next day he goes back to Jerusalem and kind of clears the temple. And I sense from that it wasn't an impulsive thing that Jesus did. He went away back to Bethany, would have stayed at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and contemplated what to do next, and then went and did what he believed his Father's will was. And I believe this is what Joseph does here when he puts the brothers in jail for 3 days. It could just be that he was a brother thinking, well, give them some sort of punishment for what they've done to me. Stick them in jail for 3 days. I don't know. Joseph's done his fair share of time in jail while he's been in Egypt on trumped up charges. But I think there's a lesson for us there in terms of when something happens to us, and we have every right often to be aggrieved by it, that sometimes, or often, nearly always, the impulsive response is not the right one. And it's right to take time to consider what happens next. Anyway, they come out of jail and another conversation ensues and a deal is agreed on. And this involves bringing the youngest brother back, which is Benjamin. The only brother with the same mother and father as Joseph. So you can understand why Joseph is particularly keen to see Benjamin. So Joseph provides the grain that they'd come to buy, but they must bring back Benjamin. And as a kind of deposit, Simeon is held captive. Joseph's very clever with the ways that he's kind of worked all this out. Simeon is held captive. And the situation for the brothers is getting out of hand. These problems are just escalating. That all stem to this one terrible act that they carried out some 20 years before. You can imagine for the brothers, they're trying to work out how can we get out of this next sorry mess. And in their bags of grain, they find money. Now we're going to see stuff about other things, silver placed in grain sacks later when, I don't want to let you in on the next bit of the story really, but you probably all know it because you've probably been to the musical. So they all find money in their sacks of grain. Now this was a test for them. Joseph, if you remember, had been sold due to their desire for money. And here he is, testing them to see what their response will be when they, in their view, inadvertently come across the fact that they've got money that isn't rightfully theirs. Now, if you want to find out what happens, you need to come back in 2 weeks. Or just read it when you get home later. So all this is to test, I believe, their honesty. And honesty is a really big deal, actually. And you don't need me to patronize you by saying, well, as Christians, we're called to be honest people. And we've all probably had experience, whether through something we've done ourselves or we've seen the consequences with other people, that if at a particular point you are dishonest about something, it can get you into a terrible mess. Because you continually have to keep peddling the lie, and then you get very confused because you often don't actually realise what's the truth and what's lies, and then you don't recall what you once said, and it doesn't kind of end until the chain of deceit is finally broken. And we'll see that happen in the next few chapters of Genesis. Well, the brothers go back to Canaan and they tell Dad, Jacob, everything that's happened. And as you can imagine, Jacob is just at a complete loss as to what to do next. And Reuben, we're in the last couple of verses, so we're kind of coming towards the end now. Reuben makes a dramatic gesture. By this point, Jacob is at the point where he's willing to let Benjamin go. Reuben says here in verse 37, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. And trust him to my care, and I will bring him back." It's a great gesture that Reuben makes. It's laudable. But as I was considering it, I kind of failed to see the sense of it, really. It just seems a little bit odd what Reuben is saying. Maybe he's just saying how seriously he takes the matter of Benjamin's protection, that he's willing to let his sons be killed as a result. But it just, to me, seems a really odd thing to say to a grandfather. Well, if I don't come back with Benjamin, then you can kill your two grandsons. It's a very strange thing to say to me. But I think he's got the right intentions there. And then Jacob, in response, says, "My son will not," sorry, I've given you a bit of a clue as to next week. "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow." So you can see that his mind is thinking, well, this is an inevitable thing that is going to happen. But his declaration in verse 38 is very interesting. He says he won't go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he, this is Benjamin, is the only one left. So you can imagine the brothers at this stage just thinking, oh, that thing we did 20 years ago, look at the mess it has got us into. Jacob says of Benjamin, he is the only one left. How do you think that makes the other 10 brothers feel? Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, they may not have had the same mother in Rachel as Benjamin, but what a terrible thing for a father to say, that he's the only one left. If I was them, I'd be saying, well, what about the 10 of us? Dad? Come on. But as far as Jacob is concerned, there was Joseph who was dead in his mind, and Benjamin is the only one left. So it goes without saying, really, this is a bit of a confused and a messed up family that Jacob has here. But this final gesture of Reuben that I've been mulling over for the last couple of days in preparation for today, however pointless it seems that he's going to go and do everything he can to bring Benjamin back, and if not, well, kill my two sons, however pointless that is, it should remind us, though, of another father who was willing to give up his only son to deliver us and rescue us from harm and from darkness. In Jacob's mind, he had an only son. It was Benjamin. In reality, it wasn't his only son, but in his mind, he refers to him here as his only son. But we must remember that God gave his one and only son, so that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And that's the only hope we have, in a father who gave his only son. And we can see glimpses of that father throughout the verses of Genesis. You'll see more of it in these next few weeks. as the story continues to uncover.